The night it happened, I was certain my life was following its usual, predictable script: quiet, orderly, and increasingly empty. Mark, my husband of 8 years, was away on another business trip, his absence announced only by the untouched side of the bed and the silence that settled too comfortably into our home. I told myself I was used to it. Still, that evening felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to break the calm. I was rinsing a mug in the kitchen when the knock came. Not loud. Not urgent. Just 3 measured taps against the door. My first thought was irritation, no one ever came by this late. My second was unease. Something about the timing felt wrong, like a sentence ending too abruptly. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there. Our neighbor. The man whose presence had quietly threaded itself into my daily routine over the past few years. His hair was damp from the cold air, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried a hesitation I'd never seen before. "I'm sorry to come by so late," he said. "I just needed a moment." Those words should have meant nothing. Yet they stirred something restless inside me. Daniel wasn't a stranger. He was the one who'd helped fix our fence, who remembered my birthday before my own husband did, who asked questions and waited for the answers. Somewhere along the way, his concern had begun to feel less like kindness and more like refuge. I stepped aside and let him in, already sensing that this choice, small and simple, was the first crack in something fragile. As he sat across from me at the kitchen table, the air between us tightened with things unsaid. I became painfully aware of how rarely anyone looked at me the way he did now, as if my presence alone mattered. Daniel's visit wasn't accidental, and deep down, I knew it. Neither was my willingness to listen. Beyond the walls of that house waited my marriage, strained, unfinished, still claiming loyalty. Inside, a different truth was beginning to surface, one that threatened to blur the lines I'd spent years carefully maintaining. The knock had done more than interrupt my evening. It had introduced a question I could no longer ignore: what happens when the comfort you seek isn't supposed to belong to you? I didn't have the answer yet. But I could feel it approaching. To understand why that knock unsettled me so deeply, you need to know what my life looked like before it happened. On the surface, it was stable, respectable, even enviable. Mark and I met in our mid-20s, when love felt effortless and promises felt permanent. He was ambitious, focused, the kind of man who planned 5 years ahead. I was drawn to his certainty, to the way he spoke about the future as if we were already standing inside it together. We married quickly, convinced that shared goals were the same thing as shared intimacy. For a long time, that belief held. We built routines, bought furniture meant to last decades, learned each other's habits the way you learn a second language, slowly, imperfectly, but with intention. But somewhere along the way, Mark began living slightly ahead of us. His work demanded travel, late nights, constant availability. When he was home, his mind often remained elsewhere, tethered to emails and deadlines I couldn't see. He never stopped providing, never stopped trying in ways that could be measured, but emotional presence is harder to quantify, and easier to lose without noticing. I adjusted without protest. I learned to fill my time, to shrink my needs into manageable shapes. We spoke about logistics more than feelings. When I reached for him, he responded, but the warmth felt rehearsed, like muscle memory rather than desire. I told myself this was normal. Marriage, after all, was supposed to mature into something quieter. Daniel entered my life during this slow erosion. He lived 2 houses down, recently divorced, carrying a gentleness sharpened by loss. At first, he was simply familiar, a neighbor who waved, who lingered long enough to ask how my day had been. What set him apart was attention. He noticed when I sounded tired. He remembered details I mentioned once and never repeated. I never planned to rely on that. Yet conversation with him felt effortless in a way I hadn't experienced in years. There was no obligation, no expectation, just an ease that made me feel visible. I told myself it was harmless. That appreciation wasn't the same as affection. But the conflict had already taken shape, even if I refused to name it. I was tethered to a marriage that still mattered, still deserved loyalty. At the same time, I was drifting toward a connection that asked nothing and offered understanding. By the time that knock came, The space between what I had and what I felt had grown wide enough for doubt to live in. And doubt, once invited, never arrives alone. Daniel didn't speak right away after sitting down. He rested his forearms on the table, fingers loosely intertwined, as if he were steadying himself. The quiet stretched between us, not awkward but loaded, and I realized how rarely I shared silence with someone who actually stayed present through it. "I almost didn't come," he said finally. His voice was calm, but there was restraint beneath it, like a door being held shut. "You still did," I replied, more carefully than I meant to. He nodded, eyes dropping to the table. "Because pretending I'm fine hasn't been working." The honesty startled me. Daniel had always been composed, the kind of man who absorbed his hurt quietly. Seeing that control loosen made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I also feared the answer. Questions, once asked, have a way of demanding responsibility. We spoke about ordinary things at first: his recent move, Mark's travels, the cold settling in earlier than usual. Yet every word felt like a placeholder, circling something we both understood without acknowledging. I noticed how he listened, how his attention didn't drift. It made me uncomfortably aware of how long it had been since Mark looked at me that way. "You seem tired," Daniel said. "Not just tonight. Lately." I laughed softly, the sound thin. "That obvious?" To someone who's paying attention. The comment lingered. I felt exposed, seen in a way that was both comforting and dangerous. I wanted to explain myself, to say I wasn't unhappy, just stretched thin. But the truth pressed closer to the surface. "I don't know when things started feeling so distant," I admitted. "I keep telling myself it's temporary." Daniel met my gaze then. "And if it's not?" The question unsettled me because I'd been asking it in private for months. Hearing it spoken aloud made it real. I thought of Mark's easy assurances, his promises to slow down someday. I thought of my own patience wearing thinner with each unfulfilled conversation. "This is where I'm supposed to stop talking," I said. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Probably." Neither of us moved. The moment balanced on a fragile edge, shaped by proximity and confession. I was aware of the line between us, thin as breath, and how easily it could disappear. "I don't want to be someone who complicates your life," he said. "But I also don't want to lie to you." I understood what he was saying without needing him to go further. His presence wasn't an accident. It was a response to loneliness, to longing, to the quiet spaces we both carried. When my phone buzzed on the counter, the sound was jarring. Mark's name lit the screen, pulling me sharply back to the life I was trying to protect. Daniel noticed. He stood, already retreating. "I should go." As he reached the door, I realized the conversation hadn't ended, it had only been postponed. And whatever came next would demand a choice I wasn't ready to make yet. Daniel paused at the door, his hand resting against the frame as if leaving required more strength than he expected. I thought he would say goodbye, offer some polite closure, but instead he turned back, his expression stripped of pretense. "There's something you should know," he said. The room seemed to lean toward us, attentive. My pulse thudded in my ears. "What is it?" He hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Mark came by a few weeks ago. He wanted to talk." I stared at him, disbelief sharpening into fear. "About what?" "About you," Daniel replied. "About the distance. He knows it's there." The revelation landed heavily. I had spent months convincing myself that my loneliness was invisible, neatly contained. Hearing that Mark had noticed had worried, unsettled that fragile narrative. "He said he feels like he's losing you," Daniel continued. "That he doesn't know when it happened, only that it scares him." My chest tightened. I thought of the nights Mark came home late and kissed my forehead instead of my mouth, the mornings we spoke in half sentences. I had mistaken silence for indifference. Now I wasn't so sure. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I tried to stay away," Daniel said quietly. "I needed to understand what I was walking into. And because I don't want whatever this is to be built on lies." The words "whatever this is" hung between us. They named something I hadn't dared to define. I realized then that the danger wasn't Daniel's feelings, it was my willingness to receive them. My phone buzzed again. A message from Mark, flight changed. I'll be home tonight. The timing felt cruel. The truth had surfaced just as the choice became unavoidable. I imagined Mark walking through the door, unaware of how close I'd come to stepping outside the life we'd built. I don't want to hurt him, I whispered. Daniel nodded. Then don't. The simplicity of his answer undid me. He wasn't asking for promises or confessions. He was asking for honesty, first with myself. I care about you, he added. But I won't be the reason you lose yourself. When he finally left, the house felt different. Not emptier, clearer. The knock had led here, to a truth I could no longer avoid. I was standing at the edge of a decision, and whichever way I stepped would change everything that followed. Mark arrived just after midnight. I heard his key before I saw him, the familiar sound suddenly heavy with meaning. When he stepped inside, travel-worn and quietly hopeful, I realized how much I had missed this version of him, the one that still looked for me first. Hey, he said softly, setting his bag down. I didn't want to wake you. I'm glad you're home, I replied, and meant it more than I expected. We sat together in the living room, not touching, the distance between us no longer invisible but acknowledged. The silence felt different from before. It wasn't neglectful, it was cautious, waiting to be filled with something honest. I know I haven't been here the way I should be, Mark said. I kept thinking I had time to fix it later. The words opened something in me. I told him how lonely I'd been, how small my needs had begun to feel, how frightening it was to miss someone who was still standing right in front of me. I didn't mention Daniel by name, but I didn't need to. The truth was present in my voice. Mark listened, really listened. No excuses. No deflection. Just the weight of understanding settling in. I don't want us to become strangers, he said. Neither did I. But wanting wasn't enough anymore. It needed to be followed by choice, by effort that showed up even when it was inconvenient. In the days that followed, Daniel stayed away. The fence between our houses became just a fence again, no longer a meeting place. I felt the loss sharply, not because I regretted the boundary, but because it represented something tender that had never been allowed to fully exist. Mark and I began the slow work of repair. Conversations stretched longer. Silences softened. Some nights ended with more questions than answers, but we stayed in them together. I learned that infidelity isn't always about crossing a physical line. Sometimes it begins when attention goes missing and someone else notices. Sometimes the greatest betrayal is the one you commit against your own truth by staying silent too long. The knock that night didn't lead to an affair. It led to clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is its own kind of reckoning. I don't know what the future holds for my marriage. But I know this: love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades in increments, and it can return the same way, if you're willing to see what the quiet has been trying to tell you all along. Weeks passed, measured not in days but in conversations. Mark and I were still living in the same house, still sharing meals and routines, yet everything felt newly fragile, as if our marriage were something we were holding together by choice rather than habit. That distinction mattered. We started therapy at Mark's suggestion. I remember sitting beside him in that quiet office, noticing how his knee bounced with nervous energy, how carefully he chose his words. It struck me then how much effort he was finally allowing himself to show. For years, I had mistaken his restraint for strength. Now I saw it for what it was: fear of failing at something he deeply valued. At home, we spoke more honestly than we ever had. Not just about us, but about who we'd become while trying to be everything else. I admitted how invisible I'd felt, how easily I'd slipped into being agreeable instead of authentic. Mark confessed how success had become his shield, how he'd believed providing stability was the same as providing love. Daniel remained present only in absence. Occasionally, I'd catch sight of him across the street, his nod polite and distant. There was relief in that distance, but also a quiet grief. He had been a mirror at a moment when I needed to see myself clearly. For that, I was grateful, even if the reflection had been uncomfortable. One evening, Mark and I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the air cool and forgiving. He reached for my hand, tentative, as if asking permission. I squeezed his fingers, aware of how intentional the gesture felt. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "I don't want to disappear," I replied. The exchange wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. It marked the moment we stopped circling the problem and began standing inside it together. "I've learned that staying isn't passive. It's an act of courage, repeated daily. It means choosing discomfort over denial, presence over ease. It means understanding that love isn't proven by endurance alone, but by attention given freely and received without fear." That knock on the door didn't end my marriage. It confronted it. It forced me to ask whether I was living honestly or simply existing carefully. The answer is still unfolding. But now, when I hear a knock, literal or otherwise, I pause. I listen. And I ask myself not what I might lose by opening the door, but what I might lose by never answering it at all.